Hello, and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, and today our guest is Dana Gioia, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. Dana Gioia is also a noted poet, translator, librettist, anthologist, and cultural critic. This is part one of a two-part interview. In this segment, we'll focus on our guest's vision for the NEA and some of the programs which he's developed during his tenure. In the second part of our interview, we'll talk more about his own poetry and his critical and cultural writing. Dana Gioia, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Good to be here in this beautiful room.
Yes, we like this room. I want to talk a little bit about your coming to the NEA. You were appointed in 2003, and this was following a decade of some strife and some controversy. There had been questions about some of the artists that had been funded by the NEA at that time during the late 80s and 90s. Robert Mapplethorpe, Andre Serrano, Karen Finley, and others. And their work was criticized as obscene or inappropriate by some people. And there were even efforts or there was talk of cutting funding radically and perhaps even eliminating the NEA altogether. Tell us a little bit about what was involved in stepping into that position at that moment and how you weathered that controversy, so to speak.
Well, the NEA is 40 years old this fall.
Okay.
It's a program that was begun in the End of the Great Society program. Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the initial legislation on September 29th, 1965. And so over this 40 years, what you've seen is how in a democracy do you create a public arts agency? It's something that there really is almost no precedent for in American history except for the WPA program. And during that time, there was a period of about 10 years where there were a lot of controversies. I'm happy to say that those things are now behind us. And one of the problems was that the NEA has given 120,000 grants in its 40-year history, but most people only know about a dozen of them, and those are the dozens that became controversial. So when I stepped into the job, one of the things that I thought was important was that the National Endowment for the Arts, as a public agency, had to do a better job of communicating what its public value was. And so I took very seriously the responsibility, in a sense, of creating the right image for this agency so that it could do its work in a democracy.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense to me on the one hand. On the other hand, and I know you've written that you feel that the organization should answer to the people, which I guess is part of this democratic thrust. And yet art so often is different, iconoclastic, goes against the status quo. Is there any sense in which you feel there's a tension there between the agency and the fact of being democratic, as you say?
Well, my vision for the NEA is really quite simple. It is to take the best of art, realizing that, the best in art are very diverse, broad concepts, and to bring it to the broadest possible public, in a sense to democratize the agency, without, in a sense, lowering its artistic values. Now, the thing about art that I think it's important to remember is that art is not controversial, it's not safe, it's not bold, it's not conservative. Art is a human language. There are a series of human languages, like in this room. Painting is a language of image, of line, of color. Dance is of movement. Music is of sound. And like any language, everything in human experience can be articulated in these languages. And so I think what we need to do is to celebrate the full range of those languages by bringing works of excellence to a broad public. The trouble is, if people don't know what you're doing, and they don't know the 120,000 grants that you've given, and they hear one grant they don't like, they typify everything else that you're doing. So it seemed to me that there was a failure of imagination, a failure of communication in the Arts Endowment historically, because it more or less took its role for granted. They figured that people would understand what it's doing. And I think that a public agency must always justify itself in a democracy. And so one of the things we did was to try to have signature programs of indisputable merit and unprecedented public reach. and to make those things that the average American, be they the average American on the street or in Congress or in the press or in a classroom, understood because they saw them in their communities.
Okay, I take it then, for example, these initiatives that have to do with Shakespeare.
Well, one of them is Shakespeare.
Shakespeare for a new generation, Shakespeare in American communities. Are these two different initiatives?
Well, they're actually two sides of the same program.
Okay.
I mean, I'll give you an example. I tend to think of the art world a little differently, I believe, than some of my predecessors did, in the sense that I see the art world as an ecology. You've got all of these segments of culture that are interdependent. And I'll give you an example with Shakespeare. You have theater companies that would like to tour, but touring is now uneconomical. You have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of actors in the United States who don't have enough work. You have a whole generation of American kids who have never seen a play. You've got American teachers who teach drama to classes that have never seen a play. And all 50 states mandate that their students study Shakespeare in high school. You've also got people that are presenters that run theaters, cultural centers, that can't afford to book serious drama. So what we did was create a program, in a sense, which dealt with the whole ecology of theater and education with a single program.
And linked it to Shakespeare.
Yes, we have, right now we have 47 theater companies that include some of the finest companies in the United States. I mean, the Guthrie, the Acting Company, Chicago Shakespeare Festival, and they are touring 250 cities and also 18 military bases with new productions of Shakespeare. Now, in the evenings, they perform these in the communities, and most of these towns are small and mid-sized communities that have no professional theater, and they perform those plays. But during the day, we bring in whole classes of high school students and their teachers and chaperones for free performances of Shakespeare. In the last 2 years, we have brought 1 million American high school students into a free production of Shakespeare. For 70% of these kids, it's the first time they've been in the theater. We've also given 1,000 actors work. We've booked Shakespeare in towns that have never had Shakespeare in their whole history. So with one program, we're meeting the needs of actors, of theater companies, of presenters, of teachers, of students, and theater audiences.
So I think I understand what you're saying about the democratization of the way in which you want to spend money for the NEA. At the same time, it sounds like you're also saying that there are so many ways that you can use the organization that would not be particularly controversial in the ways that have been before.
Not the least. See, I think you're obsessed with controversy. I mean,
I'm not obsessed with it.
What is controversy? I mean, controversy is an argument about something.
Yeah.
We do 2,000 grants a year. I think if you saw the full range of our grants, you'd be impossible to typify it. The problem with the controversy is if you have a controversy out of context, that's all people know.
Well, how does controversy happen out of context then? What happens?
If you know nothing about it, if you know nothing about an agency, and that's all you know, then the controversy becomes typical rather than.
So you think this is a public relations or marketing element?
No. I think what we're trying to do is to bring the best of art to the broadest people, and to make sure that we communicate our value. I mean, we did. The interesting thing about the Shakespeare program is that we've been able to do it entirely with incremental funds. We've been able to grow the agency's budget to do it. We still do 135 world premieres each year. We have 2,000 grants a year, and so and this is simply one little section of them. But I think what we are doing is taking a very definite public need. The fact that we have, here's what one of the things that the way I think about it is that in the years since the Mapplethorpe controversy, there's been 60 million kids born in the United States. We have people going back and forth on a controversy from the previous century, and there's no one in the United States, nobody in the media, nobody in Congress, that's really seriously addressing of what role do we want arts and arts education to play in this new generation for these kids in their education and in the community surrounding them.
Okay.
That is an enormous need in this country.
Right. But then I do think, and I will go back now to address some of your background, which is in business and particularly in marketing, that there is something of that going on in the sense that you're seeing these needs and you're figuring out ways to address them in a way that will enhance the profile of the agency.
Well, it's also, I mean, I believe the best way to run a public agency is to do the best work possible and to communicate what you're doing clearly. I mean, one thing I learned in marketing is that you try to make the best products possible. You try to communicate why they're good and to communicate it clearly. I mean, I think one of the problems with the NEA, if you think about this, is that it was created 40 years ago to enrich and enhance American life by bringing art, especially to people who didn't have it easily accessible in their lives. The way we've done this is largely through discrete grants. So we give 2,000 grants, and you can solve certain needs that way. But some of the needs that our society has for art are huge. They're national. And we have a unique opportunity in Washington to, in a sense, think on a national scale, to think not for just this town, but think in terms of millions of kids. For example, we have a jazz program that's coming out later this year that we're working with Wynton Marsalis and Jazz at Lincoln Center. This will be used by probably as many as 8 million kids in classrooms. I mean, we can talk about it more later, but that's the kind of scale that only the NEA can think of. And I think one of the problems we've had in the past is a failure of imagination, a failure to say, what are the really broad needs that we have, especially in education or in communities, and to address them on a scale that you can only do at a federal level.
Okay. So there has been, in a sense, a shift away from perhaps individual grants to larger regional or
well, we still give individual grants. We give individual grants in, for fiction, poetry, folk arts, for jazz, for translation, for nonfiction writing, for traditional arts. But what I think we're doing is think of individual grants in terms of individual organization grants, and take 40 or 50 individual organization grants and put them together under an umbrella. I mean, for example, if you fund a jazz concert in the city, you may sell out 50% of the tickets. But if you put together a whole tour and you create national publicity in it, suddenly you're selling out every concert. It's good for the presenters, it's good for the artists, it's good for the public. And it also allows you to sort of reach through the media. So what we're trying to do, and I think, is to think on a more ambitious scale. I mean, one of the cultural changes I like to think that I've done at the Arts Endowment is that we're not apologetic about our mission. We are committed to the basic vision of the NEA, which is to make art, the best of art, accessible to all Americans. And there were periods in our history where we didn't reach a significant portion of the public. I mean, 2 years ago was the first time that we really reached every community in the United States. And I'm very proud of actually giving grants to areas of the U.S. that had never done it before. Another area is the military. There's nearly 4 million Americans that are in the military families. A lot of them are at these rural bases. You've got these kids that are being raised on these bases, and they have very little access to the kind of art that would be in a community.
Well, would you address, again, it has been controversial, and I know our listeners would be interested in hearing your take on this Operation Homecoming, which was an initiative to have American military personnel returning from Iraq and Afghanistan take part in essentially writing workshops where they expressed their experiences in poetry and prose. And I do think it sparked some criticism. Could you explain a little bit about what was behind it and also what you would say to your critics?
Well, actually, we've had almost no critics, to be honest. We've only had, one small controversy on it.
There was a debate in Poetry magazine.
There was an article.
In fact, you were very, I think, much dynamically involved in that.
No, actually, I stayed entirely out of it.
Oh, I thought you wrote a letter or two.
No, I didn't.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, we've had hundreds of articles about Operation Homecoming, all of which I think have been enthusiastic about it. It's a very simple idea. And it really came out of the fact that there's a woman named Marilyn Nelson. She's the poet laureate of Connecticut. Her father was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. And she's an African-American poet. And she and I were talking about how when people are in really stressful times of their life, they need art the most, yet it's the time